Hello, my beautiful loves. Thank you for joining me for this video series. This is a series that has been on my heart for quite a while. And in this series, I'm going to be walking you guys through the correlation that I found between mood disorders. Specifically, we're going to be looking at bipolar disorder first and our human design chart. So if you have no understanding of what I'm talking about when I said human design chart, do not worry about that. I'm going to go more in depth on human design later on in this series. But this series is going to be quite expansive. And so because of that, I'm breaking these videos up into different sections. And today we're going to talk about specifically the history of bipolar, and then go into some of the criteria that needs to be present for us to be diagnosed with a type of bipolar. So as I'm going over the history of bipolar, I'm referencing the history that we find inside of the DSM. So depending on where you live in the world, you might be familiar with this term DSM, or you might be more familiar with the ICD. But essentially what these are manuals, these are books where we are able to record the criteria or the symptoms that we are looking for in order to diagnose a patient with some type of illness. So the DSM is specific to mental illnesses, and this is the manual that is commonly used inside of the United States. So this is the manual that was used to diagnose me, and this was also the manual that I was taught to refer to when I was in my master's of psychology. So let's talk about the history first and foremost of the DSM. So even though we have writings as old as 600 AD that sort of talk about this dynamic of extreme highs of mania and extreme lows of melancholy, the recognition of this as a mental illness did not come about until the creation of the DSM itself. So we have the first version of the DSM was written in 1952. And at this time, we called bipolar manic depressive reaction. So at this point, it's not even being recognized as an illness. We are seeing it as a reaction. And then we have the DSM version 2 that is released in 1968. And at this point, anytime there's a version change, we sort of take what it is that we've learned about these illnesses and we bring it back and we include it into the new version. So at this point, the major difference here is that instead of calling it manic depressive reaction, we start to refer to it as manic depressive illness. And at this time, it is sort of seen as like the brother of schizophrenia, right? Like there really isn't a whole lot of separation between manic depressive illness and schizophrenia. At this point, it's all sort of kind of muddled together. And then we have the version 3, which comes out in 1980. And this is where we really start to separate these personality and mood disorders, and we start to sort of see them differently. So in 1980, there's a few things that happen here. The first is that instead of calling it manic depressive, we start to refer to this as bipolar. And this is where this term that we're all, sort of familiar with comes onto the scene. So we call this bipolar disorder. And then we also, in 1980, we start to see the introduction of an illness called cyclothymatic. Now, cyclothymatic disorder is a disorder that is a less severe case of bipolar disorder. So as we start to have these patients come in and we start to observe these patients and we start to record what it is that they are experiencing, we start to see that there is a population of people who are experiencing bipolar disorder type symptoms, but they are much less severe than what we would consider a full-blown, bipolar illness. And remember, there's still a lot of stigma around bipolar at this point. it's still very much associated with like these psychotic episodes, these things that sort of like we have, you know, viewed as like crazy, right? And so the psychothymatic disorder was sort of like a way for us to acknowledge that maybe there are people who are experiencing these symptoms, but they're not really what we would call crazy or, you know, psychotic, but still present. Okay. And this was huge because at this point we start to kind of pull apart this idea that there is all or nothing, and that maybe there is more of a spectrum that lives here. We further see this explored with the DSM version 4 in 1994. We actually start to see a much larger spectrum coming into play. Here we have the creation of, the acknowledgement of bipolar 1 and then bipolar 2. And the difference here is bipolar 1 is the most extreme bipolar disorder. This is where we're seeing those very heightened manic episodes. This is where we are seeing more of that psychosis come into play. And then we have bipolar 2, which was our acknowledgement that there was a less severe than bipolar 1. We also are continuing with the cyclothymatic disorder here, which really should be called bipolar 3, right? But we had already coined it as cyclothymatic back in 1980. So instead of changing that name, we just carried that over. And then we also had something added called bipolar NSO, which is not otherwise specified. So there were these clients coming in or patients coming in who they didn't meet the criteria of bipolar 1. It wasn't severe enough, but it also wasn't meeting the criteria of bipolar 2. And it also wasn't meeting the criteria of cyclothymatic disorder, but there was enough similarities between what they were experiencing and what we typically experience inside of bipolar that they had to find a way to include those people in that spectrum so that they could be treated. And so it was like they need some sort of treatment, but they're not experiencing enough criteria to be given that label of bipolar disorder. So here we see the introduction of bipolar not otherwise specified. And these people were able to be treated, but they didn't quite have all of the criteria that we had already decided you needed to have to carry these labels. So then in 2013, we have the DSM version 5 come out. Now, this version 5 was, it had a revision done in 2022. There were some things that were changed and altered. But this was the last version of the DSM that we had. And here, what we did was we carried down the bipolar 1. We brought in the bipolar 2, still recognizing that there's these different severities. We had the cyclothymatic disorder, still, you know, thymatic. But here, instead of calling it bipolar not otherwise specified, what we did was we changed the name. We either call this unspecified bipolar and related disorder, or we call it other specified. And in my mind, the reason for this change, oops, I forgot the I here. The reason for this change is we're really broadening this spectrum here. We're really allowing there to be more room for patients who come in and maybe not necessarily hit the criteria of these things, but they have some of these symptoms. And these are symptoms that they are finding are negatively impacting them, maybe impacting their social lives, their professional lives, their personal lives, and they're looking for some type of process here to help them. And so what's really interesting to me, and then in 2022, we kind of talked about this, we had a revision of this 5. And so it goes into a little bit more specifics. They sort of changed their definition of mild when we're looking at these criteria or these symptoms. You know, so there was some changes, but nothing super major. So we're not gonna discuss that. the thing that I want to share about this, like when I look at the history of this, what I see is I see as acknowledging that there is something, labeling that something, watching that something, and realizing that it is a much bigger spectrum than what we originally thought. And then as we gain more understanding of it, as we start to normalize it, as we start to share with patients and doctors about what these symptoms look like, we start to get more and more and more people coming forward and saying, hey, I have these things going on. And then we're able to pull out or draw out that spectrum, right? And so the way that I sort of envision this when I think about this, let's get rid of this here, is we said, okay, we either have somebody with bipolar or we have everybody else, right? You either have it or you don't. And then what we started to do was we started to expand this. So we started saying, well, wait, this is a bigger population. There's more of the people that are out here are actually in here. And then we expanded it again. So with bipolar, we went to bipolar 1, and then we went to bipolar 2, and then we had the cyclothymatic disorder, and then we had the not otherwise specified. And we just keep widening this group as we're adding more and more people into it.